Hey, welcome back to the Spector Creative channel. I'm your host, Toy Guru Neitlich, and I make a lot of videos about the toy industry. And why am I showing you a picture of people surfing? Well, a while back, I made a video about what I called the first wave syndrome. Get it? Waves, surfing? And what this was is an analysis of how the very first wave of a lot of toy lines is very much an experiment. Yes, you would think that companies that make toys all the time, year after year, could crank out a first wave easy peasy. But it winds up not being true. Almost every toy line goes through this, and a good example is in the DCU Classics line, which I worked on at Mattel. We were supposed to have variants in the first wave of Etrigan and Red Tornado here. And this version of Red Tornado, while it was meant to be the variant for Wave 1 with classic Red Tornado, it never shipped. It did make it all the way up to package samples, but it never came out. And this is what Wave 1 syndrome is. You can see more about it in the link here. I did a video on kind of the whole thing. So that's what happens to the first wave of figures. They tend to be experiments that, tend to sort of take one for the team. But what about the final wave? What about as a toy line is sort of riding off into the sunset? What happens to that last wave? Usually it contains figures and toys, vehicles, playsets that are sort of just out of reach. You might see them in a catalog or online, but they never quite make it to your collection. Sometimes they get released overseas, and they become highly collectible and almost sort of living legend toys themselves, like Yak Face from the vintage Kenner Star Wars line. Or other times they show up in the content and never actually get their toys made, like with the Star Sisters in the She-Ra Princess of Power. They were meant to be the next wave of figures, so they made it into the animation series, but we never got toys of them. So why does this happen? Why is it so many times figures at the tail end of lines get developed, get shown, show up in the content, but we never see them in store shelves? Well, I want to first show a couple examples, and then I'll explain this, and definitely stick around till the end, because we got some fun surprises. All right, so let's talk about this line. You may have heard of it. It's called He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Well, actually, it was just called Masters of the Universe back in the 80s. And yes, I've talked about it a lot on this channel because I worked on the line for almost 10 years. All right, so back in 1987, the toy line was supposed to have a reboot where it would introduce a new character called Hero, which would be He-Man's ancestor. And he and his wizard mentor, named Eldor, were shown in Mattel's catalog, and all their accessories, their backstory, and how they were going to be involved with dinosaurs and time travel, and he was basically going to be one-on-one with He-Man as the new lead of the brand. There were also going to be giants in this line, and the giants did ship. In fact, they shipped to Europe. Both the heroic giant and the evil giant Megator here. The heroic one was Titus. And, in the all-new packaging that was going to have a new brand look for 87 to really keep the line going. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the line sort of fell apart for a whole bunch of reasons. That's a whole other video. And Hero here was shown in the catalog. We got to see him, but he never showed up. So again, he kind of became a living legend, and eventually companies like Super 7 did a homage figure where they made the figure as if he came out in 1987, which is really cool. I totally think this is one of the coolest toys that's come out in the past few years. I love that they did this. We also, of course, did Hero in the collector line for Masters of the Universe, which was Masters of the Universe Classics. But again, this was a different line. This wasn't the vintage line. He was bigger. He was 6.5 inches. He's even shown up in some of the recent entertainment, and that is what happens with toys that become this legendary status of never getting made. And it's obviously not just in Masters of the Universe. Let's look at a few other examples. So Masters of the Universe is sort of a twin line from the 80s. Thundercats had a version of this. It wasn't a hero character. It was a monster character called the Mad Bubbler. It was a toy that had a bubble feature that the mouth went up and the little fan would blow bubbles of doom, I suppose, at people. And again, much like Hero in the Masters of the Universe line, he showed up in the catalog. So if you had the catalog, you got to see him, and you knew that it was something that was supposedly coming soon, but it never shipped. And unlike Hero in the Masters of the Universe line, the Mad Bubbler actually showed up in the content. I guess kind of like the Star Sisters that I showed earlier from She-Ra. So another example of the concept existing. Another line that had this was Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Kenner put this out in conjunction with the movie. It's actually one of my favorite toy lines. And not just because it has both Kevin Costner and Alan Rickman, although the toy looks nothing like Alan Rickman, that's a whole other story, but it had basically the whole cast, and it was really a second chance to get the Ewok village if you missed it the first time from Kenner. Hey, it's easy to just, redeco something, add some more, tree leaves, and suddenly all of the Ewok things become Robin Hood things. Hey, why not? I mean, they did that with the entire line, actually. It's one of the most infamous kit bashed lines of all time, where previous Kenner lines like Superpowers and, heck, even Star Wars got used for the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. All right, but that's a YouTube video for another time. You can click the link above. What I want to talk about is the last wave. So a final wave was designed that was going to have more characters from the show, variants of Robin and Azim, as well as the King of England, King Richard himself, and some of the other Celts and bad guys from the show. This was shown in the catalog, just like Mad Bubbler, just like Hero and Eldor. But unfortunately, this wave never shipped to stores because, well, the toy line didn't really catch on. And it would have been so cool because it would have been great to get more characters from this line. The mix of soft goods and plastic, and come on, the world needs more Sean Connery toys. There's a serious lack of Sean Connery action figures in the world. And the guy's been like in everything.
Sean Connery currently sits at negative $3,000.
And your mother currently sits on my face, Trebek.
All right, so using Sean Connery as my vehicle to transition, let's go from Robin Hood to Indiana Jones. See how I did that? It's like so clever that it's almost not clever. Well, Indiana Jones, the line from Hasbro that came out for the fourth movie, had a final wave, and this one actually shipped. This was a second Raiders of the Lost Ark wave, but it didn't go to stores. It went to San Diego Comic-Con as a box set. And all 6 carded figures were put together in a large box, but they were all individually carded inside of this, and it was essentially called the Lost Wave. It was particularly cool because it contained a lot of characters that, or rather figures that were in the vintage line in the 80s, so you could now finally get them in the modern line, which, again, really great for Indiana Jones fans, but the question is, well, why didn't this just ship to retail? And, why did we have to only get this at Comic-Con and finally get characters like Tolt or, even more importantly, Marion in her white outfit, which, again, both of them were in the vintage line. So it was kind of very important for people collecting Indiana Jones toys to be able to get the characters that were updates from the vintage line, much like a lot of us are doing with Star Wars now. So, yeah, if you had the Marion when you were a kid, this is the one you had. And the one that had been released previously by Hasbro was the frying pan wielding Marion from the streets of Cairo. And as much as we like egg-making action, the toy we really wanted was the one that we had as a kid, updated. And that was served by this final wave, this Lost Wave set. All right, so as cool as this was to get, a bonus, another wave of Indiana Jones figures from one of the classic movies, it wasn't actually the only one. Because, wait, there's more! In addition to this Raiders of the Lost Ark wave that didn't make it to retail but got released at San Diego Comic-Con, Hasbro actually had another wave in development that never made it to retail. And much like in the vintage era with Temple of Doom that saw a second wave never released, there was a second wave of Temple of Doom figures. The first wave was incredible. I think it was actually one of the best waves in the entire Hasbro Indiana Jones line. Between the soft goods and the new sculpting, it was just fantastic. But it really only covered the Temple of Doom part of Temple of Doom. And for those of you who have never seen the movie, spoiler alert, the first part of it takes place in Shanghai, where Indiana Jones has a whole car chase through town, and it's very toyetic. Lego's done it. And it also has a whole sequence at Club Obi-Wan, where Indy almost gets poisoned. Well, actually, he does get poisoned, but then he gets the antidote. And yeah, it is called Club Obi-Wan. That was a sort of inside joke with George Lucas because he was the producer of the movie, and they thought it'd be funny. So yes. So the Club Obi-Wan sequence was going to have its own wave of figures, including Willie in her singing outfit, the red outfit, as well as Indiana Jones in his tuxedo, which was a direct homage to James Bond, because James Bond wore tuxedos, and Indiana Jones was looked at very much as sort of like the new James Bond. Now, these are not the actual figures. These are customs that a fan did. But I've actually been fortunate to speak to several members of the Hasbro team who've told me in detail about this line since I'm such a huge Indiana Jones fan. And yeah, they went all the way up to sculpt. They just didn't get tooled. And they had ideas for even more characters because Temple of Doom does have some really colorful characters in it, and they make great action figures. All right, so with all of these examples, why does this happen? Why are there final waves that are either shown or only go to Comic-Con? Well, the reason is the 3-year development cycle. We're so used to everything being instant, instant being ordering on Amazon, instant on demand on Netflix. Well, toy development takes 3 years, and a lot can happen between the concepting of new toys and when they actually get released on shelf. And that's what's really key, is that period of time can really affect the success of a line, but toy companies have to be ready. So, for example, if a line is based on a movie, well, the movie might bomb, and that usually is a one-way ticket to the clearance aisle. Retail isn't interested in carrying product in what's called year 2 for a line when the content doesn't do well. Now, obviously, toy companies need to plan to succeed, which is why they're planning lines out for year 2, year 3, and they have to do this when in sort of year 1. They have to work ahead. So when the movie's in theaters, they're working on year 2 and year 3, not knowing whether or not the movie is going to succeed. And that's why you see so many toy lines with these final waves that never ship, because they have to be planned so far in advance. They have to be planned on paper before you know if the first wave is going to be a success. So in other words, wave 1 comes out, we're waiting to see if the movie that it's part of does well, or if the toy line just sells well because it's just a toy line, and hopefully it does, and all the work that was done works. And sometimes it goes all the way up to tooling. Tooling is that one-time capital investment when you're spending $100,000 on the giant metal mold. So I've mentioned this in quite a few videos about why tooling is so expensive, and it's that one-time cost. Once you have the tool, you can crank out the plastic toys all you want and assemble them. So if a toy makes it up to tooling, well, it's probably going to get released because they've invested a huge amount of money. That's exactly what happened with this Indiana Jones set. It went all the way up to tooling because they anticipated the movie would be huge and the line would be year on year on year, evergreen. But unfortunately, the 4th movie didn't do as well, so that Temple of Doom wave never made it past sculpts. It didn't make it all the way up to tooling. Only the waves that made it to tooling got released. Another perfect example, one I worked on, was this Justice League Unlimited 3-pack. So it's kind of an odd 3-pack. It's got John Stewart, Green Lantern, Shiera Hall, Hawkgirl, and the Ray. And it was a San Diego Comic-Con exclusive for 2007. Was it 7? Maybe it was 8. I don't know. My memory fades. Either way, when I was working at Mattel and trying to get a JLU item for Comic-Con, because I was a huge JLU fan, I basically started digging through the books, looking, okay, what do we have that maybe hasn't been released or hasn't had a wide release? And I realized, after going through the P&L in depth, that's the profit and loss statement, that this pack had been brought all the way up to tooling. The tooling was paid for and the big investment was made, but because the retail line was sort of on the decline at the time, the pack never went into production. There weren't retail orders high enough to justify it. And a character like Hawkgirl had already been done the way she was in the beginning of the show for the first few seasons, so it wasn't really a big deal. Well, as a huge fan of the show, and since Hawkgirl was in this other outfit for like the whole second half of the series, when I found out that this version of Hawkgirl had been tooled and never released, I was like, oh my god, we have to get this out. She'd even been shown on packaging. This set was shown on the cross-sell, so fans knew about it. So essentially, we kind of had a free San Diego Comic-Con item on our hands because the tooling was paid for by the retail team. They weren't able to release it, and that's why characters like the Ray and Shiera Hall and a re-release of Green Lantern became a Comic-Con item, simply because the tooling was already paid for and it didn't get released. It was a tail-end item. The line was on its way out. It did get reinvigorated when I came on the line and became a Target exclusive, but that wasn't part of the plan at the time. All right, so the other half of the equation is, why do these toys sometimes wind up in Europe versus the US? And essentially, that's because Europe is usually 1 to 2 years behind North America in terms of content. At least they used to be in the 80s and 90s. So that's why so many toys like those Giants and Masters of the Universe or our good buddy Yak Face wind up as foreign releases, because the US market may be off a line, they may have no longer be ordering it, but the European market still is. So if a figure is going into production and it has orders to ship to Europe because they're still into the property, because they're 2 years behind, well, that's exactly why that happens. So it really comes down to already being tooled. Yak Face had been tooled, there were orders from Europe, and he went there. It's all part of that 3-year cycle. Toys have to be developed so early that they're working on future waves before wave 1 even hits the shelf. Another great example is Lodar, who was developed and designed when I was at Mattel, but then got released by Super 7 when they took over the Masters of the Universe Classics line. So I was so glad to see him released, because it was so heartbreaking to see that he didn't make it. Another great example is when I worked on the Green Lantern movie line. We had a whole plan for a second year of Movie Masters, anticipating the movie would be a huge hit. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and the second year got canceled. But it would have been really cool, and we would have hoped the collector line would have continued. So that's basically how a lot of toys wind up, being those toys that time forgot. And if they're tooled, they sometimes get released. If not, they're just on paper, well, then they become urban legends. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please do ask them below. I like to re-comment back, and subscribe, ring the bell, all that stuff. Help the algorithm.